Alright, so this week we're gonna get to the fall of the north, but we actually did not even finish everything last week. We skipped the line of David. We did get a few of the prophets taken care of, though. We got them a few slides back still. Anyway, looking forward, we have the next 2 weeks off, and then on the week we get back, we'll actually go through 3 kings of Judah, Jotham through Hezekiah, and several of the prophets. That is coming up on March 26th, even though the slide does not show that. All right. So we're jumping through like 120 years of history here today. We're going back to the point at which Jehu had killed off the king of the north and the king of the south. Jehu establishes himself on the throne up in the north. We already covered him. Now we're going to look at what happens in the south.
Is there a specific reason why he didn't just unite the north and the south? Like, were they like fundamentally different?
Yeah, they're fundamentally different kingdoms at that point in time, and the prophet told him he'd get the kingdom of Israel, not Israel and Judah. I think the king of Judah just got killed because he was in dangerously close proximity. But anyway, so the line of David continues after Athaliah, the queen, who reigns for 6 years, with Joash, who became king at 7 years old, so he got a really good long reign and still died young at 47. Oofda. I believe he reigns from 878 to 839. I don't have it typed in there.
Which one? Joash?
Joash, yep.
No, you've got it. 878 to 839.
Okay. And then his son Amaziah reigns 29 years. He becomes king at the ripe old age of 25.
That's actually a decent age to become king if your brain's fully developed.
You have no experience. Do you know of any 25-year-olds that you would like to entrust the presidency to?
Oh no.
Precisely.
That's just crazy.
It-
Okay.
Do they
Imagine
have
a
to be as old
7-year-old.
as 25? We knock a few years off.
Yeah, the previous one was 7 when he became king. It was
He was
like-
under the guidance of Yehuda or something.
Yep.
though. Wait, can you go back one, Dad?
Backslide.
Yes.
There.
Is this? Oh, I see.
What was Amaziah? 838 to
Getting to him.
809.
810. And then Uzziah gets a 52-year long reign. So we have a lot of stability going on in both kingdoms, at least as far as the dynasties go. Uzziah became king at 16 years old,
So he didn't
so
know
he
his
had a
grand-
lot of time to work.
He didn't know his grandfather was right?
Doesn't sound like he would have, nope. Yep, because Joash would have died before he was born.
Don't create.
Okay,
Is there any?
those are the only 3 that we're going to cover tonight. You want to whip out your timeline, Annabelle?
After I'm done reading.
Yep, okay.
Wait, was Asa the guy that reigned for forever and a half?
He reigned 40 years.
Uzziah reigned a lot longer.
Uzziah reigned 52.
Was there any other 50-year?
Manasseh, later, he
Manasseh.
reigns 55 years.
That's the guy.
Oh,
Yep.
that's right.
Wasn't there somebody that got like 7 days?
Zimri, 7 days, just long enough to burn the palace down around himself.
He was out with a bang.
It's not terrible.
Yep,
Okay.
just long enough to worship the calf gods and burn the palace down.
Did
All
he
right.
have a purpose? I don't
He was intentionally burned the palace down because the city was under siege by Omri, and he saw that once the siege broke through the walls or got over the walls, he saw that it was lost, and so he committed suicide by burning the palace down around him.
His satraps are calling him, hey, I got this great new tax plan. Forget it, throw it in the fire.
And Omri was like, we need to build a new capital.
It's like, yeah.
What?
Why would you burn yourself if you were gonna commit suicide?
I don't know. Yeah, I've never understood that one either, but they had a lot fewer options back then than we have today. So
Oh, that's wow.
It sounds so bad.
I know. All right, moving back to this. Athaliah is most likely a daughter of Ahab. The Bible actually describes her as a granddaughter of Omri, who was Ahab's father. So she's descended from that line of kings. And her grandfather on her other side was the king of Sidon, Jezebel's father. So Athaliah is one of the bad girls of the Bible. She kills off the entire royal family of Judah. She thought she got everybody except she missed one son, who was Joash. Joash gets hidden by Jehoshaphat, his aunt, the wife of the high priest of Jehoiada or Yehuiada, or however you want to pronounce his name.
Yehuida.
Yehuiada,
So-
that works. Yep.
Jehoiada.
So she sets herself up as queen. She rules for 6 years. Ironically, the palace is right next door to the temple, and Joash goes completely unnoticed to her because apparently she was never in the temple complex.
Well, that's unfortunate.
It worked really well for him.
I don't see her on the thing here.
Athaliah, she would be down in the southern kingdom, right before Joash.
Wasn't he like a baby though?
He was a baby. He was 1.
So would she know like this 1-year-old is necessarily him?
Yeah, he could have been disguised as well. But she was worshiping false gods in Jerusalem. And I don't think the
for all we know,
temple
they
How
was...
did they prove that this was a son
Or,
of
like,
him?
I mean, they could have thought it was
Hey, my
different.
1-year-old just happens to be a secretly adopted heir of the line of David.
Yeah, genetic testing is not something that they had back then. So I don't know if anybody even demanded a proof of paternity like
Imagine if they
from
just
this
like
kid.
switched out babies,
Hmm.
and so the
Funny.
real Joash disappeared, and they had some other random.
Yep, nobody would know what that...
Nope.
Hmm. I'm pretty sure that everyone just decided they would take the high priest at his word because he was the high priest.
Yeah.
So
What would that be the equivalent of today? Would that be like the Pope saying something?
maybe.
Or what would that be?
Anyway, so Joash begins his reign at the age of 7, and while the high priest Yehuiada is still alive, things go really well, and he's righteous. Yehuiada dies at the ripe old age of 130, which is the oldest age this far after the flood of anybody. But to put this in perspective, he would have been born during Solomon's reign, lived through Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, Ahaziah, and been in his hundreds when he puts Joash on the throne.
You're really?
Yes, really.
They
No-
all had
no
that
one
short
did-
of reigns? Cumulatively?
Look at it on the timeline. Pull it out.
No wonder he's always
So,
he's a really old guy.
yeah, Joash started reigning in what year again?
Right,
878.
878. So you go back 130 years from 878, and you have the temple under construction in the beginning of Solomon's reign.
But did he die right when he crowned Joash?
No, he didn't die right then, so we don't know exactly how old Joash was when he died. It seems like Yehoiada was probably alive for a good 15 to 20, maybe even 25 years of his reign, which would put him being born towards the end of Solomon's reign,
That's still
but still definitely during Solomon's reign. So-
He was likely educated under Solomon's reign mostly, and
Maybe, or he might have been a baby, and then he would have grown up under Rehoboam's reign. And then he would have been marked like, we really should have stayed, like,
together.
following, worshiping the God the right way. So he would have learned a lot, seen plenty of palace intrigues, learned from Asa's mistakes, learned from Jehoshaphat's mistakes.
So he was alive during Solomon's reign, but he was a baby when he was hidden in the temple.
Joash was a baby hidden in the temple. Yehuida was alive way back in Solomon's reign.
Oh,
High
wow.
priest at
The
the
guy
time
who
of
did
King Joash.
The guy who did the
was
hiding.
alive during Solomon's reign. Joash was the baby when he was hit.
We get that straightened out?
Yes, sorry.
Good. A lot of he's in the Bible, so good to straighten those out. So Joash repairs the temple. This is the first time it's repaired since Solomon built it. You can imagine a building is 130 years old or so. It probably is going to need some renovations because they do need some fixes. Yep. One of the downsides of his reign is the high places were not removed. The other thing that requires fixing is when you have kings stripping the gold off of the doors of the temple, and from time to time to pay off the invading army, you have to
Yeah.
regild surfaces.
Who was it that did that again?
A lot of people did that.
I was gonna say, we read that.
Treasuries got cleaned
Somewhere.
out in every other reign, and
Yeah.
anyhow.
Yeah,
So-
it seems like the pattern is cleans out treasury, restores treasury, great reign, cleans out treasury, restores treasury, great reign, cleans out treasury.
There's a pattern. You're right. Every generation has to decide to follow God. And they can change their mind in the middle of it, like Joash did. So Yehuida dies, and Joash turns, sets up Asherah poles and idols in Judah. Zechariah, the son of Yehuida, and I mean, if Yehuida was 130 when he died, Zechariah could have been 110. So we don't know how old Zechariah was, but anyway, he was Yehuida's son. He also could have been very young, though, because Yehuida's wife was Joash's aunt. She probably was 70 years younger than him.
Let's not think about that
Okay.
too much.
Yep, because she was the sister of the king Ahaziah, who we know was quite young at that time. Yeah, anyway. Yep, anyway. So Zechariah is probably a younger son. He gets stoned to death in the temple courtyard. It doesn't go well with him. Sometimes being a prophet was a dangerous line of work.
What was the other good thing about Joash's reign? On the last page?
He,
Oh, it was did not turn on the high places, right?
Yep. He did not remove the high places.
So not.
That's not good. They actually found one of those high places in an archaeological site, and they found remnants of marijuana and
Oh my gosh.
various hallucinogenic drugs that are known today. And they're like, wow, they actually had that woven into the worship back then.
Do you reckon they smoked it like we do today, or do you reckon it was?
Smoking it somehow, I can't tell you how. That is just a recent find.
Maybe like a big
Where do you
bonfire.
learn this?
Scholars are good. I'm well read.
They use for incense.
Yeah, it would be an incense. It'd be something that would be fragrant, but then everybody would be smelling it.
Or like a big bonfire.
Yep. So,
That's on the chapter now.
Oh.
anyway, towards the end of Joash's reign, he gets attacked by Hazael, the king of Aram. Remember, he was anointed to be king of Aram by Elisha, or one of his Elisha's servants. Joash pays off Hazael with the temple treasuries after repairing the temple, of course. Joash goes severely wounded in the battle, and then his officials conspire and assassinate him, which is why he died at the young age of 47.
Man, he has such a promising start.
He had such a promising start. Remember, a promising start does not always lead to a promising ending. You have to run your race through the whole of your life and end well, too.
You know what's sad though? Like the children's book would like describe him as this amazing king. They never mentioned the like latter part of his life, and so like until more recently, I always thought he was this great king who
He
was
was
like
yeah.
David
Yes,
Parr
yes.
and like followed. Yeah.
And children's Bibles sometimes obscure certain parts because, especially when you've got a child king who's righteous, like that goes over really well in a Bible, children's Bible. So
Children's
that
Bible.
he starts worshiping the Asherahs and gets wounded in battle and is assassinated, it's not going to happen. Anyhow, so his son is Amaziah. And I always like to think of him as Amazing Amaziah because he defeats the Edomites and then he takes their gods that they failed to save the Edomites and he worships them.
What?
Like amazingly stupid. I don't know how this works. Like he does what's right, not quite wholeheartedly. He takes his army out, defeats the Edomites. It's a very decisive battle, steals their gods, which is normal. That's like taking part of the plunder and the loot because gods are going to be made out of gold and silver. Unless, of course, you're the people of Judah, and then there is no gods to steal. Like, we don't have anything. In the northern kingdom, they had calf gods out of gold. But he takes the gods of the Edomites and then bows down and worships them.
That's the dumbest fight we've ever
Yes, there's
Wow.
several kings of Judah that repeat this idiocy, but I think Amaziah is the first one who does that, which is why I sometimes refer to him as Amazing Amaziah, because he was amazingly stupid.
How did the Edomites get into the idolatry? The last time we heard of the Edomites before this would have been Esau and it was Jacob who had the gods, the false gods of this company, not Esau.
Yeah, so we don't know exactly how they revved into that. They moved to the south of Israel, and they intermingled with another people, the people of Mount Seir, or the Horites. And so the three of those kind of amalgamate into the kingdom of Edom. And we actually do see them when they come up out of the Israelites come out of Egypt. They have to pass by the Edomites and stay out of their land because they came out to their border. And God said, you can't pass through the land of the Edomites or take it from them because that's the land I gave them. They get subjugated by David. He does something that would be considered a war crime today. He had all the men of Edom lay down in a row, and then he took a length of cord. He'd measure out 3 lengths of cord, and 2 out of the 3, they would execute all the men. And then the 3rd one would survive.
That would be a war crime.
Yep, that would be a war crime today. That was customary back then. That was how you subjugated people that you just defeated in battle. So Amaziah, after defeating the Edomites and worshiping their gods, is all cocky, and he challenges Israel to a fight. And at this time, the king on the throne of Israel is Jehoash, who we already covered, and he's at like the end of his reign. He's got a year or 2 left, so he's an old, wizened, and battle-hardened king. And he tells Amaziah, go back home, don't pick a fight with me, glory in your victory over Edom, but don't pick a fight with me. And Amaziah won't back down, and so Jehoash goes and just destroys his army. And everybody runs back to their home, and then he comes to Jerusalem. He empties the treasuries. Apparently they were restocked, and they broke down a 600-foot section of the wall of Jerusalem for good measure, humiliate the king. Did not go well for the king. He does survive for 15 years after this, or 14 at least, but he ends up fleeing Jerusalem. The conspirators against him chase him down in Lachish, which at this point seems to have become the 2nd most prominent city in Judah. And they assassinate Amaziah there. Thus, we get to the end of Amaziah.
Wait, I need to.
So this is 3 kings in a row assassinated. We have Jehoram, and I think he's the one who dies of the bowels disease, and no one lamented that he died. His son Ahaziah gets killed by Jehu in the chariot race. They execute Athaliah. Joash gets assassinated, then Amaziah gets assassinated.
Wait,
That's
in the
fine.
chariot race?
Ahaziah.
Oh, Ahaziah.
Mhm.
It's a chariot race.
So Uzziah is the first king in a really long time that dies of more natural causes. Not since Jehoram did somebody have the luxury of dying from a disease. But Uzziah makes it to a really old age. I think he was 68.
The luxury of study first.
It's better than a violent death. Like,
True.
the options that they had available were brutal. So he's a righteous king. The high places remain, but he sought the Lord what seems to be the majority of his reign. I think some people put him back getting to about his 50th year before he does stupidity. So that would be up at 66. So you might even say old age and senility was getting to him, perhaps. Who knows?
Exactly. He was just like falling
Mhm.
apart to bad brain issues.
Right. So Micaiah would like this guy especially because he like invents siege works and counter siege works,
Yes.
builds giant towers on the walls of Jerusalem,
Instead of
and
measuring
brings
capacity.
Jerusalem to a whole new level of defensibility.
Yes.
He probably had to start by rebuilding the wall that got destroyed in his father's reign, but he ended up with a very large army that was extremely well trained and well supplied, which is a novelty for that day because it wasn't just sending out peasants with their pitchforks. He had men armed with swords and shields and spears and armor. So they were in good shape. And they could defend Jerusalem quite well. And in his grandson's day, we'll find out in 3 weeks, they put that wall and all those things to the test, and it held.
Was it Jotham?
Ahaz.
That's for.
So at some point, we don't know for sure. Be a little quieter, maybe. He gets arrogant and wants to usurp the role of the priesthood. You remember God said that kings are kings and priests are priests, and you don't cross these lines and roles together. And Uzziah felt that he was all that and that he should be able to offer incense in the temple of the Lord just like the priests. And he wanted to usurp that role. The priests, and there were quite a few of them assembled, tried to keep him from doing that, but he told them to, or put them in their place, and then leprosy breaks out on him. And when this happens, his son Jotham ends up on the throne because the king is a leper and he can't live in the palace any longer. That is thought to have been a very short year or two interlude there where Jotham was ruling as viceroy, so to speak. Alex, you have a question?
I just wanted to write down, who's the guy that lived to 130?
Jehoiada. Jehoiada.
And the first to have that longevity since the flood.
Yeah, that's recorded in scripture.
Well, the
To
most.
put that in perspective, if he was alive today,
He'd be the
he
oldest
would have
person.
seen every war conflict since the
Spanish,
First World War.
Spanish-American War.
Spanish American 1890s.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
Yep. He would have been Ansley's age in the Spanish-American War. Yep.
That's a traumatic life.
Crazy.
Alright, I got it.
That is
Lots of
very
Yeah, he
traumatic.
saw a lot of wars.
Lots of Bibles and revolutions and new things.
Yes.
Yeah.
What?
Probably by the
Since
about the
1890.
60th conflict. I'm having a beer, let 'em fight.
It'll all work.
Yes. All right. Shifting to the Northern Kingdom. So things got chaotic after Jehu's dynasty ends. There's like 10 or 11 years where we don't know who was on the throne between Jeroboam II and his son Zechariah. Zechariah gets the throne only for 6 months in 773. Shalom gets the throne for a month in 773.
Must have been thinking, there's no way I can't outlast Zechariah when he just
Yep.
sat on the throne.
And one of his generals, Menahem, was like, well, I'll show you. And so Menahem gets 10 years. His son, Pekahiah, is the last son to inherit the throne of Israel. He gets assassinated by Pekah, who is easy to confuse. You get a Pekah and a Pekahiah.
So is it just like a, whoever kills the king gets the kingship, or is it, did he actually have like,
Yeah, oftentimes it worked that way because most people didn't try to take out the king unless they thought they could survive the experience. And in Judah, the assassins usually died. Athaliah is the only one who was able to murder off most of the king's house and actually be able to rule. But otherwise, like Amaziah put his father's assassins to death. And I think Uzziah may have done the same, but assassins didn't have a good survival rate. In the northern kingdom, however, they usually got the throne. The lone exception of that would have been Zimri, who had the throne for a mere 7 days, and then he was assassinated, or he committed suicide by burning himself to death in the palace when Omri attacked the city. Maybe Omri had a reputation that Zimri was trying to avoid. Who knows? Anyhow, Pekah takes the throne. He's on the throne for 20 years. He gets assassinated too, though, and there's more chaos because Hoshea, the person who assassinates him, ultimately gets the throne, but there's a 9-year break between him assassinating the previous king and him actually getting the throne. So this is a really chaotic period for the northern kingdom. We covered Zechariah last week. Shallum is the guy who assassinated him. He's the son of Jabesh. We don't know what tribe he's from. He gets to reign 1 month in Samaria, just long enough to be assassinated by Menahem, son of Gadi. And I don't think it even says whether or not he continued in the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. He just didn't reign long enough.
I mean, Zimri did.
Yeah, I know, Zimri did in 7 days, but Menahem or Shallum's not given that.
Maybe it wasn't like a festival month or something, so we didn't have enough time to like.
Yep, that could be. So Menahem assassinates Shallum, and he attacks or sacks the city of Tifsa, which I found there is actually not a consensus as to what city Tifsa was. Some people place that as a city on the Euphrates River, and other people place that as a small town near Tirzah or Samaria. The Euphrates River is a really long ways away and really deep into Assyrian territory to make realistic sense of why a king of Israel would be sacking that city. So I think it's probably one of the smaller cities of Israel at that time. But they didn't want him to be king. They resisted him, and so then he rips open all the pregnant women after he breaks in. And this gives you an idea of how violent this period of time was. And this comes across in a few of the prophets, one we haven't gotten to yet, but I think Zephaniah. One commentary on that is that if Zephaniah were made into a movie, it would be an R-rated movie. We can see what you think of it if you read that later, but it's definitely a violent time. He continues in the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. During his reign, and possibly right at the very beginning of it actually, the king of Assyria, who's named as Pul, some translations will translate it as Tiglath-Pileser, but I don't think it's actually Tiglath-Pileser, I think it's Pul, invades the land, and Menahem uses him to secure the throne actually. Somehow he taxes all the people, and all the rich people contribute to pay 1,000 talents of silver as tribute, and Assyria withdraws. One of the key things that this reveals, though, is that the northern kingdom of Israel is not fully independent anymore. They're now a tributary state in the Assyrian Empire. And this is right after Jehu's dynasty wraps up. So Jehu's dynasty broke the back of the Arameans, but that pushed them right up next to the border of the Assyrians, and now just shortly after that, the Assyrians are pressuring really badly. So Israel becomes a tributary state to Assyria, which in those days is essentially you're paying protection money to the king of Assyria.
Right, they got paid off.
Yes, we give you money, you don't destroy our land. And this type of relationship was very common back in those days.
Does that ever translate to we're being attacked, we need your help?
Oftentimes, because people who are being attacked don't tend to pay taxes and tribute, and so the king of Assyria would have some reason to want to go to their defense, but it was not necessarily a guaranteed defense, and so all these countries always maintained their standing army anyway, because they didn't take that as granted.
Well, I don't mean to jump ahead and slow you down, but when you see, I don't know, not that much farther down the road, the 721 Assyrian exile, is that tied into any of this?
Yeah, that we're working right towards that.
Okay.
So this is Assyria's first run-in with the northern kingdom. Menahem dies, Pekahiah takes over. He reigns 2 years, I think. He continues in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. One of his officers, Pekah, the son of Remaliah, conspires against him with 50 men of Gilead helping him. They assassinate Pekahiah in Samaria, and Pekah becomes the king. Micaiah. Okay.
Man, you can get lost in the weeds, I'm telling you.
Yeah, there's so many weeds, and then at the same time, like, it's not organized really well for understanding quite so cleanly.
Until that new Stella is found, which is coming, right?
Right, the new one that we're going to dig up someday. You just never know what they're going to dig up next and what it'll confirm. But
I made one of those in college.
one of the things I've found is that archaeology almost always ends up supporting the scriptural accounts.
Yes.
Eventually, sometimes they'll get misinterpreted. Like one time they found walls of Jericho that had fallen out, and they're like, oh, this proves that it wasn't actually God taking down the walls of Jericho. It was just a battle or something, and then somebody else came back and said, actually, if it was an army breaking into Jericho, the walls would have fallen inward. So if the walls fell outward, that is definitely a sign this was a supernatural event, because walls don't fall down to the outside when armies are breaking them to the inside.
Unless maybe they angled walls so it'd be harder to climb.
There's a possibility there too. But yeah, there's all kinds of archaeological arguments that go on, but ultimately things always seem to line up as like, this is authentic, this actually supports the scriptural account.
Amen. Yes, they do.
Pekahiah gets assassinated by Pekah. Can we move on, Micaiah?
Yep.
Okay. So now we get to Pekah. He's the second to last king. He continues in the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, like many of his predecessors. He allies with Rezin, the king of Aram, against Judah. And so this is a unique thing, because now we have Aram as a kingdom that's intact again. And so apparently Jehu's line only subjugated them in the days of Jeroboam. Now we have another king of Aram, and they're actually working against Judah together. This is in the days of King Ahaz, so we'll see this siege and attack from the other end, but Jerusalem holds, even though they defeated Judah in a fight in the field. Shortly after that, though, and this actually was in response to that, King Ahaz sends envoys up to the king of Assyria, which would be like if Guatemala and El Salvador were having a fight. Guatemala calling upon the United States to come to their aid. Like Judah calling for Assyria was like getting the regional superpower to come and lay the smackdown. And so Assyria comes in and they completely eviscerate Aramea. I believe that everybody in Damascus gets deported somewhere else into the Assyrian Empire. That kingdom is no more and doesn't come back to the surface again. And Israel loses most of the northern swath. They lose everything around the Sea of Galilee. They lose Gilead and Naphtali and Asher. And they all become territories of the Assyrian Empire. And so the northern kingdom of Israel is reduced to a very small piece of land around Samaria. It'd just be the heartland of Ephraim and Manasseh's territory. And a lot of the people that were Naphtali and other tribes end up getting deported to Assyria at that point in time. So they get deported on a few occasions. When you get defeated that badly, usually you end up getting assassinated. So another guy gets assassinated here by one of the generals, Hoshea the son of Elah, conspired against Pekah and assassinated him. And now Hoshea is the last king, and it's interesting because we don't know how this all transpires, because he assassinates Pekah, and 9 years later he assumes the throne. We don't know what happens in between there. And it starts off describing Hoshea as doing evil, but not like all the other kings who preceded him. Because what were the preceding kings known for their evil?
Baal worship, you name it.
Idolatry, typically worshiping the calf gods, the standard sin of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but some of them were in Baal worship and Ashtoreths and stuff like that. Hoshea's evil is actually rebelling against the king of Assyria and stopping the tribute payments. And that was something that God was not going to allow without retribution. Part of it is that Assyria wasn't going to like that. But this is the evil that he does that is unlike his predecessors, and this brings an abrupt end to it.
I would have thought that's something God supported.
Right. And amazingly, it isn't. And you see this regularly, actually, from this point on. There's a few times, the prophet Jeremiah will see this play out a couple times down in the kingdom of Judah. Serve the king of Babylon. Do not attack the king of Babylon. Don't rebel. It'll go badly for you if you rebel. It's a constant theme of Jeremiah. And when we get down there a little bit, we'll kind of look at the role of these empires that God seems to have instituted and analyze that a little bit. But so rebelling against Assyria was not a good thing. He had sent envoys down to Egypt, stop paying tribute. He was trying to shift sides. Egypt would be the competing superpower that was trying to rise up against Assyria. It generally was not going well for Egypt at this time. They were not as strong as Assyria. So Shalmaneser is the Assyrian emperor at this point in time. He attacks Israel. He lays siege to Samaria for 3 years, and the city of Samaria falls at the end or during Hoshea's 9th year. We have never endured a siege in our country in a really long time. Probably not since the American Revolution. Maybe there was a siege or two in the Civil War. But a siege for 3 years would break a population, and there was one in the days of Elisha that would give you an idea of what it was like to endure a siege. But after this happens, all the rest of the Israelites get deported by the Assyrians to other regions in the Assyrian Empire. That was their population pacification policy. If you take a people away from their homeland and park them somewhere else, they're less likely to rebel and revolt. And the Assyrians did this regularly. The Babylonians do it then after them as well. Thus ends the northern kingdom of Israel, and then Judah is left alone. Any questions on the history thus far?
Do you reckon God was like assimilating the like Jews into other nations and having them be conquered in preparation for the Messiah? In like the sense where like if you had a nation of Jews and you know Jesus popped up, the king could easily interpret that as someone is trying to steal the throne, and so they could just do away with Jesus if he popped up, you know? Whereas if you have it as a group that's subjugated by like a greater power, the Jews are subjugated by a greater power, they're more likely to listen, and there's a greater, like, it's a more favorable condition to have a Messiah in.
It's an interesting hypothesis you throw out. This definitely does not play out with the northern kingdom. They kind of vanish and lose any sense of identity. They're called oftentimes the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And in fact, the Mormons, their belief is that they migrated over here to the North America and became the Native American Indian tribes, and that those were the lost 10 tribes of Israel. They have no historical or archaeological or genetic background for that, but that is what's written into the Book of Mormon to explain the existence of Native Americans back in the 1800s. We can see that they went to various different places, but they did not maintain their cultural identity the same way that the people of Judah did. Now, what you just described does play out after the Jewish diaspora, which is when they were spread out and scattered all over the world, because they maintained their cultural identity. They continued following the ways of the law of Moses, and they had patterns that set up for Paul and Barnabas going on their missionary journeys, which we'll look at next year when we get to the New Testament survey portion of this. So,
Diaspora 79 AD. That
Ye-
one?
say what?
79 AD for the Jewish diaspora.
Yeah, they get scattered a lot of times. Not that one. I was thinking of the one that happens when Babylon takes out Jerusalem, which we'll get to in a few weeks here. It sets up the New Testament. 2 prophets we'll look at as we wrap up here. 2 minor prophets. The book of Hosea. Hosea is a prophet who primarily prophesies to Israel, but he sends or has a few messages about Judah as well. The beginning of his book has an interesting storyline to it, where he's living out a prophetic image in his life. God commands him to marry a prostitute. His wife gets pregnant a couple times. He has interesting names for his children, like Not My Son, or No Mercy, and there's a meaning and a message to this. His wife leaves him and goes to another man, and then he has to go and buy his wife back.
What a mess.
Exactly. But what does that sound like?
Jesus.
That sounds like Jesus redeeming his creation. He bought us back. So that Hosea has an interesting life. He issues lots of prophetic warnings in the later part of the book. That's an interesting read. is actually 14 chapters, so even though he's a minor prophet, he's longer than Daniel, who is a major prophet. Go figure.
That's one of the few prophets you really don't want to be.
Yeah.
You don't really look up to that as much.
Mm-hmm. And in Ezekiel, there's stuff that Ezekiel has to do you never want to repeat in life. And a lot of them have interesting things. Nahum is one of the most, is another unique minor prophet. You memorized a verse out of it. All of his prophecies is to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. And so he's a prophet of Israel, and he doesn't say a single word to Israel or to Judah. He's prophesying to the big superpower and the capital up there. And it's interesting because you remember Jonah also went to Nineveh. And whereas in Jonah's generation, the whole city repents, in Nahum's generation, they don't. And he is prophesying the fall of the Assyrian Empire, which was something the people of Judah were looking forward to because they were not happy under the pressure and power of the Assyrian Empire. This actually ends up getting fulfilled in 626 BC when Babylon gains the ascendancy over Nineveh and Assyria. We'll get into that, but on your timeline, actually, it's got the kings of Assyria laid out on the bottom there. That is James Ussher's chronology, and he was working with the sources he had. He didn't have access to all of the archaeological evidence that has come up on the Assyrian Empire since his day. He only had historical records to work with. He didn't have any archaeology. So I can't vouch for all of the accuracy of that part of that timeline specifically. But he does have every single biblical interaction. We'll talk about Assyrian chronology another time. So, all right, we wrap up with that. Any final questions?
Yeah, could you go back to Zechariah and Shallum? I didn't think you told on that.
Sure, I'll go back there. While Micaiah's writing stuff down, does anybody have any minutia of the Old Testament that you have not seen me produce yet that you want me to do? Obviously emphasizing the historical side of things much more so. We did definitely hit a literary element for a while in, is that January? We did a lot of that poetry forms and such. And we've woven in some of the archaeology, and also some of the apologetic stuff around the creation and the flood. Is there anything missing that you have thought of?
I'd like a few more map references when it comes to the like moving people.
Maps, when we're moving people.
You could do a day on,
General.
you could do a day on like messianic prophecies, or you could do a day on like destruction of the world prophecies. Either of those would be fun.
Yeah, we have one day, if we don't have any more, any snow days or anything else, we have one day that is yet to be determined, and we could go through a bunch of the prophecies of Daniel that week. That is an option.
Yes,
I like that idea.
I like Daniel.
Everybody likes that idea.
Who doesn't like Daniel?
Who wants to study the Bible when we study the end of the world?
Exactly.
No, that would be some good stuff in there. Actually, that reminds me, I forgot to mention, the meditation coming up at the end of this month is Joel 2:28 through 29, and then 30 and 31. And so this is a unique meditation. I'll give you a little background on it. Peter quotes this in Acts chapter 2. But if you read Joel 2:28 and 29 and cross-reference those ideas and those words, you will find in a concordance at least 7, 8, 9 times that is prophesied in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so that is actually one of the most common passages that are found word for word or almost word for word. And that something we'll look at when we get to the days of Daniel. But
Have a good week, everybody. I gotta get
yep.
Bye.
See ya.
See ya.
That'll do.